The wind rolled over the plains like a restless tide, sweeping dust and grass in its wake, but it carried little comfort for the cowboy who stood at the edge of his land. Eli Tanner was a man carved out of hardship, with sunburned skin and hands made rough by years of ranch work. His cabin stood solitary against the horizon, a place built strong enough to hold off storms yet empty of the laughter he had always longed to hear. He had cattle, horses, and acres of earth beneath his boots, but no family to come home to when the day's labor ended. That yearning was sharpened one afternoon when a wagon came rattling down his trail, carrying not one, but 7 children with fear etched on their faces. They looked half-starved, clothes worn thin, and eyes far too old for their years. The eldest, a boy not yet grown but carrying the weight of a man, stepped down first. His jaw tightened as though bracing for another fight with life itself. Behind him, 6 smaller figures huddled together, clinging to each other with desperate loyalty. Eli had heard whispers in town, how cruel in-laws had driven a widow and her brood from the last place they called home. But he hadn't expected the story to roll onto his land in such a raw, aching form. He stepped closer, his voice quiet, careful. "You children belong to the Ramirez widow, don't you?" The boy nodded stiffly. "We do, but we got no place left. They said if we come back, they'll split us apart. Said we don't belong together no more." His lips trembled, but pride forced him to lift his chin. "We won't let that happen. We need a man who'll keep us. Who'll keep her safe." Eli's chest tightened. These weren't children begging for charity. They were fighting for their mother, clinging to family with claws and teeth. He looked past them, half expecting their mother to appear, but she hadn't arrived yet. Instead, the youngest girl, no more than 5, tugged at his coat with wide tear-filled eyes. "Please," she whispered, "marry our mama. She cries when we sleep. She thinks we don't hear, but we do." The words hit Eli harder than any blow he'd ever taken in a saloon brawl. He had wanted a family, 7 voices to fill the silence, warmth to break the loneliness, but he hadn't expected the plea to come from trembling lips of children. He knelt so his eyes met theirs. "Where is she now?" The eldest boy's throat worked as he swallowed. "She stayed behind with the wagon. She said she couldn't ask no more of nobody. But we came anyway. We ain't letting her go back to them devils." Eli rose, dust scattering from his knees. Something inside him, long dormant, stirred awake. He walked with them down the trail until he saw her, Maria Ramirez, standing beside a tired mule and a wagon leaning under its own weight. She looked smaller than he remembered, worn by grief and labor, her dark hair streaked with silver that spoke more of sorrow than age. When her eyes lifted and found her children standing beside Eli, panic flared, followed swiftly by shame. "I told you not to trouble him," she said, her voice low, heavy with defeat. "Mr. Tanner has no place for burdens like us." Eli stepped closer, stopping just a breath away. "Ma'am, your children think otherwise. And truth be told, so do I." She blinked, as though his words couldn't quite pierce the fog of exhaustion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've worked this land near 10 years, with nothing but my horse and the wind for company. I wanted a family once, thought it'd never come. But your children," he glanced at the 7 faces pressed close, watching with hope and terror mingled. "They're asking me to give you all a home, to give you my name. And I reckon it ain't just their wish, it's mine too." Her hand went to her mouth, tears spilling. Unbidden, for years she had bowed under the cruelty of in-laws who never forgave her for surviving while their son did not. She had prayed for deliverance, not for herself, but for the children she'd sworn to protect. And now, here stood a man not offering pity, but promise. Eli extended his hand, rough and scarred, yet steady as stone. "I can't promise ease, Maria. But I can promise this, no one will ever tear you or your young'uns apart again. Not while I draw breath." The silence that followed was broken by a small sob from the youngest child, then a chorus of arms wrapping around Maria's waist, urging her forward. Her hand trembled as she placed it in his, the weight of her past loosening its grip with that single touch. The wind swept across the plains again, but this time it carried something new, laughter rising fragile but real, the sound of a broken family finding its beginning again. And for the first time in many long years, Eli Tanner no longer stood alone on his land. The sun dipped low behind the ridges, pouring long shadows over the empty spread of Eli Tanner's ranch. The cattle bawled in the distance, the horses stomped restlessly in the corral, and the wind whistled through the cottonwoods, but all of it only emphasized the silence of the house that waited for him each evening. Eli rode slow, his hand brushing the worn stock of his rifle out of habit, though there was no threat this night but the ache in his own chest. He had built this place from nothing, timber by timber, fence post by fence post, yet it had never felt complete. He wanted voices, not just one, but many. A family large enough to fill the table, to run across the fields, to keep him company long after the sun went down. But each year passed with no bride, no children, and only more work to distract him from the hollowness inside. He was 35 now, and the thought of dying without ever knowing that warmth made his nights heavier than any winter storm. It was on one such evening, as dusk bled red into purple, that Eli saw dust trailing up the long road toward his land. He shaded his eyes against the light, thinking at first it was a lone rider. But soon he made out the shapes of several small figures clustered together, the creak of wagon wheels behind them, and the weary plod of a mule. Curiosity pulled him down from the saddle. He waited by his gate as they drew near. The children reached him first. 7 of them. Their faces were gaunt with hunger, their clothes little more than rags, their eyes filled with the kind of hardness only suffering could carve. The eldest, a boy of perhaps 14, stepped forward with shoulders squared though his knees shook. Behind him, the others bunched close, the littlest girl clutching a worn doll with stuffing peeking through the seams. "You're Mr. Tanner?" the boy asked, his voice breaking but determined. "I am," Eli said slowly. His gaze swept the little troop. "What brings you here?" The boy swallowed hard, then lifted his chin. "We got nowhere else to go. Mama, she didn't want us troubling you, but we can't go back. Our uncle and aunt, her in-laws, they said they'd scatter us, send us to different homes. Said we ain't family no more since Papa's gone. But we are. We won't let nobody split us." His voice cracked again, but he pressed on with fierce pride. "So we came here. You got land, you got room. We need a man strong enough to keep us together." The youngest girl stepped forward then, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. She tugged at Eli's sleeve with tiny fingers. "Please, mister," she whispered. "Marry our mama. She cries at night when she thinks we're sleepin'. We hear her. We don't want her to cry no more." The words slammed into Eli like a hammer. His throat went tight, his chest burned. For years he had begged heaven for a family, but never in his wildest imagining had he thought they would come to him like this. 7 weary children, desperate to save their mother. "Where is she now?" he asked, voice rough. The boy jerked his head toward the wagon, and there, standing with one hand resting on the mule's worn flank, was Maria Ramirez. She looked smaller than Eli remembered from the market in town, her once proud posture bent beneath invisible weight. Her dark hair, streaked with silver, fell loose around a face lined by worry. She clutched the reins as though they were the last thread holding her upright. When her eyes lifted and found her children standing beside Eli, panic rushed across her face. She hurried forward, skirts dragging in the dust. "I told you not to bother him," she scolded, her voice frayed and trembling. "Mr. Tanner has no reason to take on the likes of us. Children, you have no right." Eli lifted a hand, cutting her off gently. "Mrs. Ramirez, they came because they're afraid. Afraid of losing you, of losing each other. And from the sound of it, they're right to be." Maria's shoulders sagged, tears glistening in her eyes though she fought to hold them back. "I can't ask this of you," she said hoarsely. "It's too much. We're too many. We're nothing but trouble and mouths to feed. You've worked hard for what you have, and I won't see it ruined by us." Eli stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the dirt. "You didn't ask, ma'am." "They did. And truth be told, I've been waiting half my life for what they're offering." She stared at him, stunned, as though his words made no sense. "What they're offering? Their children, Eli." Lost and frightened. What could they possibly? "A family," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving hers. "That's all I ever wanted. 7 children and their mother. That's more than I ever hoped for. I can't promise you ease. This land is hard, and I'm harder. But I can promise this. No man alive will tear you apart while I draw breath." The children pressed closer to their mother, their small faces lit with fragile hope. Maria's hand trembled as she touched the crown of her eldest son's head, then her youngest daughter's cheek. She closed her eyes, fighting the tide of fear and longing inside her. For years she had bent under her in-laws' cruelty, blamed for her husband's death in a riding accident, shamed for every hardship, treated as less than human. Her only shield had been her children, and now even they had been threatened with separation. She had prayed for deliverance, but never had she expected it to come in the form of Eli Tanner's steady hand. He extended it now, scarred and rough, yet strong as the earth beneath them. "Let me carry the load, Maria. Not alone. With you. Say yes, and I'll give you all a home." The silence stretched, broken only by the mule's tired snort and the faint whistle of wind through the grass. Then, slowly, Maria placed her hand in his. It was small in his grip, but it fit as though it had been meant to rest there all along. The youngest child let out a hiccup of a sob, then laughed through her tears, hugging her mother's skirts. The others joined, relief and joy flooding faces that had known too little of it. Eli felt his chest swell as he looked at them. 7 lives and 1 weary woman, suddenly bound to him by vow unspoken yet stronger than iron. That night, Eli threw open the doors of his cabin and watched it come alive for the first time. Boots clattered on the wooden floor, childish voices echoed against the beams, and the kitchen fire glowed warm with Maria's careful hand stirring the pot. The table that had always sat empty now overflowed with noise and need. Eli sat at the head, his eyes roaming from face to face, hardly able to believe it. Maria caught his gaze across the table, her expression still guarded but softening under the sight of her children eating their fill. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to breathe. And Eli, watching the light return to her eyes, knew he had been given more than he'd ever dared dream. But he also knew this peace would not last unchallenged, for cruel men never let go of those they wish to control. And somewhere out there, Maria's in-laws would hear of this union, and they would not rest until they tried to tear it apart. The morning after Maria and her children first stepped into Eli Tanner's cabin, the ranch was alive with a kind of energy it had never known. 7 small pairs of feet thudded across the porch. Laughter rang out as the boys discovered the creek, and the younger girls twirled with makeshift dolls beneath the cottonwoods. Inside, Maria moved with quiet purpose, her hands steadying a home that had waited too long to be filled. Eli watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with something that felt too big to name. This was what he had prayed for in the lonely years, this clamor, this warmth. And yet, beneath it all, a shadow lingered. He knew trouble would come riding. By the week's end, word had reached him from a neighbor. Maria's in-laws, the Dunns, had been in town, spitting venom about the widow who ran off with her litter. They spoke of court orders, of blood rights, of tearing the children back by force if need be. Eli felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. That night, when the children were tucked into bed and the fire burned low, Maria sat across from him, her hands twisting a dishcloth. "They won't stop, Eli," she whispered. "The Dunns, they've hated me from the moment David died. They said I was cursed, that I ruined their son's life and shamed their name. Now they want the children, not because they love them, but because they want to punish me. They'll drag us to court, or worse. You don't know how cruel they can be." Eli leaned forward, his eyes steady. "I've seen cruel men, Maria, and I've stood against them before. They won't take you. They won't take the children. Not while I've got breath left in me." She looked at him then, truly looked, as though measuring the strength in his words. And for the first time, she let herself believe. The weeks that followed bound them closer. Eli taught the older boys how to ride and mend fences, their pride swelling as they proved useful. The younger children followed Maria through the garden plot Eli had left half wild, planting seeds with laughter that carried across the fields. At night, around the fire, the cabin pulsed with a life that wrapped Eli in warmth. Slowly, Maria's guarded heart began to ease. She caught herself smiling more, her laughter returning in small bursts. And when Eli brushed her hand one evening as he passed the dishes, she did not pull away. But peace is a fragile thing, and it shattered one gray morning when a group of riders appeared on the ridge. Eli saw them from the barn, a line of men, hard-faced and mean, with Mr. Dunn himself at the front. He was a heavy man, broad-shouldered, his eyes burning with spite. They came down slow, dust rising from their horses' hooves, until they drew up at the gate. "Eli Tanner," Dunn bellowed, "we know she's here. Send the widow out with them brats, and we'll be on our way." The children huddled at the window inside, fear thick as smoke. Maria stood pale, her hands clenched, her body trembling as if she might shatter. Eli stepped forward, his rifle resting easy in his grip. His voice cut through the morning air. "They're not yours to take, Dunn. They're under my roof now. My family." Dunn spat into the dust. "Your family? You think putting a ring on a ruined woman makes those children yours? Blood says otherwise. The law'll say otherwise too." Eli's gaze hardened. "Blood don't make a family. Love does. And you don't know the first thing about that." The other men shifted in their saddles, waiting for Dunn's word. For a tense moment, Eli thought they might rush the gate. But Dunn sneered, tugged his reins, and spat again. "This ain't over, Tanner. You'll regret crossing me." With that, they wheeled their horses and rode off, dust clouding the sky. That night, fear crept back into the cabin. Like a thief, Maria sat at the table, her hands trembling. "They'll go to the sheriff, Eli. They'll try to take the children through the courts." Eli reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Then we'll fight them in court. And if it comes to worse, we'll fight them here. But I won't let them win." "You believe that?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I want to. God help me, I do." The court battle came swift and bitter. Dunn used his money to twist the law, painting Maria as unfit, her children as burdens. But Eli stood beside her, his voice steady as stone. He swore before the judge that he was their father in all but blood, that his land was their inheritance, that his heart was bound to theirs. Maria spoke too, her voice breaking but strong, telling of nights she had kept her children alive with nothing but scraps and love. And when the children themselves, one by one, stood up and begged to stay with Eli and Maria, the courtroom wept. The judge's gavel fell with a sharp crack. Custody was granted to Maria, her marriage to Eli binding the family together under the law's protection. Dunn stormed from the courtroom, his threats echoing, but powerless now. When they returned to the ranch, the children ran free across the fields, laughter ringing so loud it seemed to drive away every shadow. Maria stood on the porch, tears streaking her cheeks as she watched them. Eli came to stand beside her, his arm brushing hers. "They're safe now," he said softly. She turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude deeper than words. "You saved us, Eli. More than once." He shook his head. "No, Maria, you saved me. I was a lonely man with nothing but empty rooms and silence." You gave me life. You gave me 7 voices to fill the air, and a woman strong enough to stand beside me. For a long moment, they stood in the golden light of evening, the sound of children's laughter weaving around them. Then Maria reached for his hand, not trembling now but sure, and Eli clasped it tight. The wind swept over the plains once more, but it no longer sounded lonely. It carried the echo of something whole, something strong, love that had been forged through hardship, and a family of 9 that no cruelty could ever tear apart again. Eli Tanner, once a solitary cowboy, now stood not as one man but as the heart of a family. And Maria, once broken by grief, found herself lifted by a love that was steady as the land itself. The ranch that had been silent for too many years now pulsed with life. And together, they knew, no storm, no enemy, no shadow could take this gift from them. They were home, at last.